which is kind of a surprise. When you think about stuff being made out of cardboard, you think it's not going to hold the models very well, but that really isn't a problem with this stuff. In this series, we'll build each kit from the Fantasy Village set by Battlesystems, discussing any construction pitfalls and build mistakes, as well as kit-specific build tips and possible conversions. Once everything is built, we'll test a variety of methods to colour the edges of the terrain, and then finally conclude with an in-depth overall review video of the whole fantasy terrain set. Follow along and consider subscribing if that sounds like something you don't want to miss. I just want to say really quickly that this video isn't sponsored by Battlesystems in any way, but I do want to give a shout out to Battlesystems because they did send me a copy of their logo so that I could use it in my video thumbnails, and that's about it really. They were just happy for me to do an honest review. Before we start, I want to mention quickly that if you want to see a thorough build guide for each kit, as well as watching the Battlesystems tutorial videos, you can check out my playlist, which includes a video for each of the buildings. And I've also made a single video that includes some build tips that, basically apply to any of the buildings that you might be building up. And there are a few tips that you kind of good to know before you start. Now, if you've seen my Daylight Lumi lamp review, you'll know I've got some particular views myself on what makes a good review. In particular, I really do think that you guys watching need to know my own biases, my preconceptions and expectations really about the terrain in order to get the most out of the review from your perspective. If you know these things, i.e. where I'm coming from, then you'll know how your expectations differ from mine, and you can then better apply my comments and final scores to your own situation in terms of whether this terrain system is right for you. So my biases are that I have made some scratch build terrain in the past. Now that includes sort of full-on scratch builds with bits of balsa wood and cardboard, like this kind of thing here. I've also used some of the Hearst Arts molds to cast some plaster brick, build them into structures like this tower here. I've also got some experience building some sci-fi terrain. Here I've got some Mantic Battle Zones terrain. It's fairly modular with some extra bits and pieces that I've added on to make it look a bit better. And finally, I've also used some other cardstock terrain in the past. This is a Dave Graffer model, so these, you basically buy the files, you print them out on cards yourself, then you build them. So I guess it's also worth saying is that I do enjoy making scratch-built terrain, and when I do it occasionally, I do think it can look as good as the pre-made stuff. As long as you spend some time and do it well. But I'm going to be honest, I never seem to make enough to populate a whole gaming table. It just sort of takes too long. So with this Fantasy Village set from Battlesystems, I'm really looking for a terrain set that I can buy in one go that will basically populate a whole 6x4 gaming table at a reasonable price. Those are my expectations. Now, I also expect any sort of non-scratch built terrain to be more portable and easier to store, and it should be somewhat modular to make it worth getting over building stuff yourself, because you're going to be paying probably a bit more than if you just scratch building it out of stuff that you got left hanging around. Another thing to note in terms of my expectations and my experiences when I'm making this review is that I'm going to be mainly playing skirmish games and war games. I'm not really going to be using this terrain for RPGs, so although you can go inside these buildings and there's like bits of furniture and stuff that come with the set, I'm not really looking at that so much. I'm looking at the aesthetic of this terrain on the tabletop for sort of larger games. So with all that, you should have some good ideas about how my experiences with building terrain and what I want out of this set may be similar or may differ from yours. And so when I'm giving this scores out of 10 and I'm talking about certain aspects of it, you'll know whether or not those things are exactly relevant to your situation, or whether you need to kind of adjust in your mind what I'm saying based on your own situation. I got my terrain through the Kickstarter, so I just want to show really quickly everything that was included in the Kickstarter, just so you can compare it to what's available at retail. Now, everything on the Kickstarter has become available at retail, but some of the stuff that was available in the pledge that I got is now basically something that you have to buy separately. During the Kickstarter, you could either choose from the Fantasy Village, the Battlefield, which is like a ruined battlefield, or the Citadel, and I really like the Fantasy Village. I thought you got, most value for money. So in the Village Pledge, you get everything in the retail box: townhouse, lake house, tavern, storage barn, thatch cottage, bunch of small buildings, cart, well, outbuilding, some fences, some lake pieces, or extra walkway, a few indoor pieces, the clips you need, but you did also get some additional stretch goals, and those stretch goals are now available to buy separately. So I also got a blacksmith forge, some extra road pieces, the bridge, a few extra fences, also some village ruins, which is basically a small part of the ruined village set. And then I did also buy a full retail ruined village set as well, because I really like these. You also get a little bit of the marketplace, which is basically half of the marketplace set, and you also get half of the graveyard set, basically not the mausoleum, just the small pieces. A few other bits and bobs, like you got a snow-coloured roof for the tavern, and you also got a fantasy portal. Overall, my set includes quite a lot more than just the fantasy village set, but everything I've got is available to buy separately. Just looking at the fantasy village set here, you can see everything you get, and the fantasy village set as standard costs £80, and you can usually get that about 10% less at other online retailers. So here's the extra pieces over and above the fantasy village set that you need to buy if you wanted to get everything that I have. So the blacksmith forge, that's an extra £20, another village ruin set, £25, marketplace, I'd say that's sort of take it or leave it. The ancient portal, £5, again take it or leave it, you might not want that. So £150 is what it would cost to get everything that I bought. That includes a couple of extra packs of brown clips, and sort of via the Kickstarter I think I probably paid in total about £110 for it. So, you know, a reasonable discount, but not that far off retail, considering you can usually get about 10% off if you buy it from a third-party retailer. What I would say is if you're looking to just go for the fantasy village set, you get a lot in there. So for £80, I think that's a good starting point really. The blacksmith forge is a really good add-on, and so is the village ruins. I'd say the brown clips are worth getting if you don't mind spending that extra sort of £10, and you'd need a couple of packs to do the whole fantasy village set with the add-ons that I've got. Now, I'm going to look at a couple of different aspects in this review. I'm going to break it down into quality and usability. So in terms of quality of the terrain, I'm going to be looking at the quality of individual components and the final product as a whole. So individual sections of terrain and, whole buildings on the table as a whole experience, basically. I'm going to break this down into visual quality, which is somewhat subjective, and I'll also include relatively objective aspects such as print quality and quality in terms of durability. I'm then going to look at the usability of the terrain, so basically how user-friendly the terrain is, and I'm going to break this down into building it, storing it, transporting it, and how easy it is to use during gameplay. Then we'll just finish up with some comparisons to other terrain sets in order to give an idea of value for money in comparison to what else is out there. So starting with visual quality, I think this terrain looks really good. Now I do really like the low fantasy style, so cottages, blacksmiths, bridges, fences, old wooden carts and cobblestone roads. It screams like old world Warhammer to me, and that's probably why I really like it. So there is a like a portal thing, which I guess is a bit more high fantasy, but all of the non-sci-fi terrain sets from Battlesystems, so this one, the Citadel and the Battlefield and the Northern Settlement, they're definitely more of a low fantasy, almost historical sort of feel to them. So if you're looking for something with a historical, semi-historical feel to it for the tabletop, there's probably going to be something here for you. And for me personally, I think this fantasy village set is ideal for either like a fantasy game or a more like a medieval style game. Now, I'm just going to hold my hands up and just say, from the feel of the terrain, that's all subjective. If you want terrain for Age of Sigmar, then, this stuff will probably work from a gaming perspective, but it doesn't really fit in with that, dialed up to 11 style of Age of Sigmar. Again, that's my opinion. Saying that, you do get the portal, which is, basically a realm gate. And, who's to say that there isn't a medieval sort of low fantasy settlement somewhere in the realm of beasts or whatever. So, let's be honest, we're playing with toy soldiers on the tabletop, so, it is what it is, isn't it? I've built up all of this stuff and I've looked at it very closely, and I'd say the print quality is really very good, both in terms of the actual visual quality of the artwork and the registration of the printing. So in terms of the artwork design, pretty varied. The roofs here, very different, blue slate with some green slate, sort of more warmer colours on this roof here. I think there's a lot of variety in the artwork, even though a lot of pieces are reused on some of the buildings. And I would say personally, I feel like the level of detail is, pretty good. You have a look at this ruined house here. It's not exactly the same. There's You know, there's burn marks where the building has probably been burnt at some point. You know, in my opinion, I think it just looks good. Small bits of vines and stuff, you know, creeping up inside the buildings. You know, a lot of fine detail, tiny little splits in the tile shingles here. I'd say it's probably a similar print quality in terms of detail to this Dave Grafman model. This one looks a little softer, although I've arranged for this to be printed myself, so possibility that in the printing process the details have sort of softened up a little. For this stuff, I think it looks good. You know, tiny little cracks in the mortar here, you know, lots of detail. I also feel like visually there is a nice kind of 3D nature to what is basically flat artwork. So these tiles here, you know, when you just look at them, you glance at them, they do appear sort of pretty 3D. Same as the stones on the building here, you know, it does read to the eye as being quite 3D, which, you know, is important in order to sort of like sell the visual aspect of the whole set on the table. Now, when I say about registration, I'm talking about whether both sides of the printing sort of line up properly, i.e. has it been printed back to back in the correct position. And especially important for this type of terrain is whether the cuts in the terrain line up properly with the printing, which in 99.9% of the pieces I've seen it does. Just a quick point on this registration aspect. How many board games have you played in the past, you know, where you got like round tokens, maybe it's meant to be a coin or something like that, and you look at it and the printing is way off center? You know, it's kind of fine, but it's not ideal. Occasionally you might even get ones where you got white around the edge of the token because the bleed of the printing has even been sort of cut off. You know, sometimes it is that bad. And, you know, I've seen that in some fairly popular games, so fair play to Battlesystems, I'd say. They've clearly spent some time with the factory they've used in making this stuff to make sure that everything is done well. Now, when you think about the complexity of, like, you know, these pieces of terrain in comparison to like a board game where you're just punching sort of like round tokens out, you know, it's really very, very important that the cuts are in the right place. You know, they've got to be the right depth, the right width. And as I said, this is done really well on nearly all the pieces. You go back through my video where I'm putting stuff together, you know, I do moan about a few things, but the quality of the cutting generally is good on near enough everything. I have found a few pieces that weren't cut quite enough, but only one or two that were cut too much. And it's definitely better to be cut too little because, you know, we can go back in with a scalpel and widen some of these cuts here. But if they're cut too wide, like say if that cut there was too wide, this piece would just be flopping all over the place, and it's not. This stuff goes in quite tightly, and that's what you want. So yeah, you know, kudos to Battlesystems. I know from following the Kickstarter and a previous Kickstarter that they spent a reasonable amount of time back and forward with their factory in China, I expect it was, making sure that the little quarter cuts that they do on the roofs, making sure the cuts that go through where bits of terrain slot together, just making sure they're done right, really, because the precision does need to be there, and, you know, by and large it is. So, you know, fair play to a small company for getting that sorted properly. Now, these clips, you know, they're an essential feature of all of the buildings on the Battlesystems terrain. So, you know, there's some here on the lake house, and then you've got other like clips. They're not really clips, but they're sort of cardboard sections that hold different pieces together. So you really notice that on the roofs. These clips in particular are a real central part of the whole Battlesystems system on all of their sets. And personally, I don't find these to be particularly intrusive once the set's built. As you're building it, you're thinking to yourself, these are going to stand out loads. And when you look for them, they kind of do, because, you know, buildings don't have these on them in real life. But once they're on the table, I'm going to be honest, I don't really notice them. I think it's one of those things where your brain reads it as a house, you know, as a lake house, as a broken house, a ruined house, as a house that's about to sort of like, you know, fall over. Your brain's not saying, what about that clip? Unless you are intentionally looking for it. Having said that, obviously, as far as terrain sets for an immersive gaming system go, you'd rather not have them, which you can't. You can't not have them for this terrain set, but in an ideal world, you wouldn't have clips, you wouldn't have adjoining pieces, you wouldn't have sort of grey edges on the terrain here. It would be absolutely perfect. So on that basis, I'm going to have to knock a couple of points off on the score, but I will say that that's, you know, kind of being a bit harsh, because I think once they're on the table, they don't stand out that much. The other thing I'm going to mention is that I've upgraded to these brown clips, which I think look better than the grey ones. That's another reason why I'm going to knock a point or so off on the score, because the grey ones do stand out a little bit more than these brown ones. So that's something I would recommend if you are buying this set. If you're going to spend a little bit extra money, upgrade to the brown clips. Overall, I'm going to give the visual quality a solid 7 out of 10. I would rarely ever give anything a 10 out of 10, because that would basically mean it cannot be improved at all. And that's pretty much impossible for anything. So I think 7 out of 10 is pretty solid, and that's based mainly on what I consider to be really nice artwork and the overall aesthetic on tabletop, which I personally really like. So I was thinking of maybe giving it a 6 out of 10 because of the clips and that kind of stuff, but then I thought, no, you know, how long would it take to paint up this level of detail if you were building something either from scratch or you maybe bought some MDF terrain that you had to paint yourself? This level of detail would take forever to paint. So based on that, the fact that this is pre-painted as such, then I'm going to bump it up and say 7 out of 10 for visual quality. Clips take away from it a little bit, but overall I think it looks really good. Now, when thinking about quality in terms of durability, you're really going to need to consider what you want out of your terrain in order to judge this Battlesystems fantasy village. It's made of, you know, pretty strong cardboard. You'd have seen that if you saw me, you know, building it up. As far as cardboard goes, it's pretty strong. So if you're going to compare it to, say, something made out of MDF or a strong resin, it's going to be a lot more likely to bend and possibly fold than those two other materials, but it's going to be less likely to sort of like snap, like say for example with resin terrain, or if you've got an MDF building built up that you sort of drop on the floor, which could quite easily crack apart at the glue lines. This stuff is going to kind of most likely bounce. So, you know, there's some pros and cons when it comes to using cardboard, but overall it's definitely not as strong as other things that you could make it out of. What I would say though is, having handled this stuff a fair bit while making the terrain and making a bunch of videos, I would say that it is definitely pretty durable. I've used the Hurst Arts mold to make terrain out of dental plaster, which I showed you earlier. That is rock solid, but they're heavy and you need to put an absolute ton of varnish on them if you don't want them to chip. And if you do drop it, no, forget it. It's basically blowing up into a million pieces. This stuff won't be ruined in quite the same way if you drop it. On the other side, you move a building off the table and put it down on a chair and you sit on it, it's toast. You know, you're going to squash it and it's going to be dead. So, like I said, pros and cons of this type of terrain. One thing you really need to avoid with this stuff though is getting it, you know, really wet. If you saw my one video where I accidentally left the leg of this in my wet palette, you'll know that very quickly water can basically just destroy this printed surface. So, you know, if you haven't seen that video, what I did is I was building this up and accidentally left it with that leg sat in my wet palette. This got completely soaked, splayed out, and I made the mistake of picking it up and squashing it back together, which basically ripped all the artwork off this bottom section here. You can see what I have done is put some Citadel Wildwood contrast paint over the top of it, and I think that's really blended that problem area back in. And also what you'll notice is, once dry, it's back to the same strength that it was prior to me being an idiot and leaving it in my wet palette. So what I would say is, even if you get this stuff wet, just leave it and let it dry. Don't handle it. If you handle it while it's wet, all the printed surface will just come off in your fingers, and then you're going to have to try and like repaint it somehow. I'm going to be honest though, if you're at risk of getting this stuff completely soaking wet, you're probably doing something wrong. You know, I don't know why you'd be getting this stuff really soaking wet. So I guess what I'm saying here is that yes, this card terrain is not as strong as most other terrain building materials, but it's a lot lighter, it's more flexible, and depending on how you're going to handle it, it might be equally durable. It just depends on how you handle your stuff really. So if you're careful with your terrain, you know, this stuff could definitely be for you. If you're the kind of person that sits on it all the time, forget it. The other thing I thought about as well is that if you're interested in this terrain set because it's pre-painted and you don't really want to be painting or touching up chip terrain again and again, this stuff could be a good option for you. I mean, over the years it will eventually rip and tear a little bit, so you might need to sort of like touch it up a tiny bit if you wanted to, but I really don't think that's going to be much of a difference to say if you had like resin or MDF terrain that was painted. So in terms of like general durability, I'm going to give this terrain set, and I think this applies to all of the Battlesystems terrain, I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. I think it's really good for what it is. So as far as card terrain goes, I think this is going to be like almost as good as you could make it. But overall, despite the pros and the cons I've mentioned, I think overall it's not going to be quite as durable really as MDF terrain or other plastic terrain maybe. Certainly plastic terrain would be more durable overall. You know, some of this stuff, if it creased and folded, it's going to get damaged more easily, but I think I think 6 out of 10 is a fair score because yes, it's cardboard, but it is still pretty strong, and we'll do a few little tests when it comes to the usability and durability during gameplay, so stay tuned for that. I think you'll be surprised at how much weight some of this stuff can actually handle. So we're going to move on to talk about the usability of the terrain now, and I'm going to talk through the whole process from building it, playing with it, storing and transporting it. So we really need to talk about building this stuff. So the fact that it needs to be built up but not painted does need to be considered when you're thinking of buying this. So if you've seen any of my build videos, you know that it's not particularly complicated to build this stuff, but it does need to be done with care and does take a reasonable amount of time. There are a few sort of tips and tricks of how to avoid some issues when building this stuff, so I recommend watching that video that I made. There's a few things that can go wrong quite easily. So if you're looking for pre-painted terrain as a massively hassle-free experience, the build process of this terrain might be really quite annoying for you. If you're hoping to get this stuff out of its packaging, pull it together in an hour and have a big game with it, then that's not going to happen. Quite a bit of effort needs to go into getting all this stuff ready to play with. I would say that for the whole Fantasy Village set, you're going to need to spend, really almost like a couple of full days building it if you want to reduce instances of damaging the terrain during building. If you want a fully hassle-free experience and money isn't an issue, I would say don't bother with this. Just pay someone to build and paint a bunch of terrain kits for you, because this battle system stuff is not ready to go out of the box. But like me, if you're fine with building this stuff, I mean, I built a lot of this over the Christmas holidays, and I got up in the morning and I was really looking forward to building it. I liked it. It's like part of the hobby for me. If that's like you, if you enjoy the building aspect of your models and also your terrain pieces, then don't worry about the build. Yeah, it can be a bit tricky at times, but it's it's reasonably good fun, and you can see yourself, you're making more and more of it as the day goes by, and you're getting somewhere reasonably quickly. I say reasonably quickly, like I said, I reckon a couple of full days minimum really to build up everything to a good, a careful standard. That's all I'm going to say about building this terrain. I've got a bunch of videos that document in detail the build process for all of the buildings, so just go and watch those if you want an idea of what it's like to build this stuff, or just watch the Battlesystems introductory tutorial videos of how to build each kit. You kind of see what I mean about the fact that it's not complicated really, but it can't be rushed. It's going to take some time. So usability in terms of the build process is actually quite a difficult one to give it a score on. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10 because it does take a reasonable amount of time to build all this stuff, and you have got to be careful, and you do need something like a Stanley knife or a scalpel to make little modifications as they come up while you're building it. It's not really easy. At the same time, I found it to be quite fun. That's why I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. It's not Lego, but it's not the most complex thing in the world either. And what I would say, as far as this type of cardstock terrain goes, I think Battlesystems have got a really good balance between intricacy and detail and things just fitting together well near enough all of the time. So when I give it a 6 out of 10, it's not really criticisms of Battlesystems, to not give it like a 9 out of 10, for example. It's more a case of like pretty much any cardstock terrain like this with the level of detail that you got here is not going to be really, really quick and easy to put together. So 6 out of 10, there it is. Watch some of the other build videos if you want to know more about why it's not a complete disaster to build, and also why it's not a real nice like 9 out of 10 easy peasy job done type of thing. Another aspect of usability of this terrain is the storage. Now, I don't know about you, but I've got limited space for the zillions of models I've collected over the years. Not to mention, board games, all the tubs of sand, rock, loads of flock, tons of paint, glue, all the rest of it. I don't have much space for loads of terrain on top of all that, so storage for me is a real key consideration. And in my view, that's a real positive of this battle system terrain, and partly, or mainly really, is because it's pretty modular. So we'll have a look at this townhouse, which is kind of like your building blocks of most of these terrain pieces. So ground floor, upper floor with gables, and then a roof. That's how most of these pieces go together in, slightly varying configurations, but pretty much like that. Straight off the bat, I'm going to say that you're not going to want to deconstruct this stuff completely and, completely take it apart every time you play with it. It will take absolutely ages, and it will increase the risk of damage, and it will be, frankly, a real pain in the ass. I'm just going to say that. It's going to be a real pain. What I mean by that is you don't want to take the chimney off, you don't want to take this roof apart. You can probably take those gables off, that's not really a problem, so that's one piece, but you're not going to want to take the building completely to pieces. Now, when I first got the Kickstarter, I was thinking that maybe you could do that with some of this stuff. Certainly their sci-fi terrain, like the corridor terrain, that would be a bit easier, but seeing how long it took to build all this stuff, I think just straight away I'm going to say forget that. You're not going to want to do it. You might want to, say you were going to move house and you wanted to take it all apart and pack it away in some small boxes. Yeah, maybe you could do that once, but you're definitely not going to want to take this stuff completely apart every time you play with it. However, it is very easy to just take the sections apart for storage. So if you think that's a building that needed that much space in a box, quite a high box, it now needs less space. You probably just keep that roof on, to be honest. The roofs are a bit more tricky because you're not going to want to take those apart, but you know, you could easily take the gables off, put them inside. You're just talking like a minute, well, less than a minute to take that one apart, you know, a few seconds really. Like, basically what I'm saying is that each of the larger pieces can be broken down into 2 or 3 or maybe even a few more smaller pieces reasonably quick, oh no, very quickly really, that allow for a lot more stuff to go into, say, boxes or put on a shelf or whatever when it's not in use. One extra consideration I would say is that this stuff will fare worse than MDF or resin or plastic terrain if you're keeping it somewhere that's quite damp. So maybe like if you've got a really damp basement, I would say that this stuff is definitely going to have to go in a fully sealed box. I think this stuff will soak up the water over months and years, way worse than other terrain. I mean, if you've got it in a really, really damp environment, then pretty much any terrain is going to probably end up going moldy and be a bit horrible, but I think this stuff will fare worse. In terms of storage usability for this terrain, I'm going to give this a real solid 8 out of 10 based on the fact that it can be disassembled a bit really easily, basically just due to the modularity of the larger pieces, and it is also really lightweight, which may be a consideration if you're wanting to put it like up in a loft or somewhere where you don't want to overload your storage space. Now, I would have given it a 9 out of 10 if you could sort of like more easily disassemble it to a larger extent, but you know, I'm confident that you're going to end up reducing the longevity of the terrain if you try and take it apart much more than just doing that. So 8 out of 10, good for storage. So linked to the storing it, what about transportation? So similar things to consider really. So it's cardboard, so it's very light. Weight isn't an issue when it comes to transporting it. You're not lugging around heavy stuff. The Hearst Arts thing I showed you earlier was for Frostgrave. 3 or 4 of those in a box, and it's pretty heavy. It's not as easy to lug about. You can get all of this stuff in a box and you can lift it up with one hand. It's not heavy. This stuff can kind of flop around in a box because it's lightweight. It's not heavy pieces bashing into each other. It's going to be a fair bit more durable than, say, heavy plaster or resin terrain. It's not going to get damaged much. What I'm saying is if you're just jostling it around a little bit. So in terms of transportation, a really solid 9 out of 10 for me. With just a little bit of careful planning, this terrain is very easy to transport safely and easily. I mean, I'm really talking about like local transportation. You know, you're putting it in the car to take around your mate's house or down the gaming club or whatever. So if you needed to take this stuff abroad in like a suitcase or somewhere where you're not going to be monitoring it, I would say that's where it does fall down a bit, because if it's in like a soft box or a suitcase or something and it gets smashed around, you know, potentially it's going to, you know, get squashed basically is what I'm saying. So that is a very minor consideration for me. I'm not going on a holiday with my cardboard terrain. So forgetting about that, a solid 9 out of 10 for your normal transportation needs. One of the most important considerations whether this terrain is going to work for you obviously is going to be the usability during gameplay. You know, the 2 key things really from my point of view are going to be if the card terrain is tough enough to handle models being moved on it, and like related to this, whether the modular nature of the terrain means that the buildings are going to kind of like stay together while you're moving your hands around them. So just to sort of show this and to test it out a little bit, I've got 2 of the most delicate buildings, and they're most delicate just, you know, because they're not full buildings, so they're not supported on this side. These are from the Ruined Village, and I know they are a little add-on to the Fantasy Village, so you might not get them, but what I'm showing with these is some of the issues that you might encounter, and some of those issues will be less apparent with a full building like this that is a lot more stable. Straight away with these you can see that I've modified them a little bit to provide some extra stability on this edge at the front. So these are not completely standard, so that's something else to keep in mind. If these were standard, these pieces wouldn't be here and they'd be a bit more at risk of tipping over. So the point about your hands knocking it when you're moving models around, that's going to be more apparent if you're using the insides of the building. So I mean, these don't really have an inside, they're sort of ruined, so you can sort of move models in and out of them quite easily. But if you were playing RPGs and you wanted to go into the building, straight away there I took the roof off and the building moves a little bit. I wasn't being super careful, but you can see what I mean. That's not falling apart as I shake it a bit, but if your model's there and you're reaching behind it and you're not careful, it's quite light, it's modular, it's going to get knocked about a bit. It's just how it is. These issues are going to come down to how careful you are with the terrain. So personally, I feel that having the option to get inside it and to be able to move models around inside, the benefit of that really outweighs the downside, which is that it makes them a little less strong on the tabletop. It gives you more variety, really, more flexibility. If you are never going to play skirmish games and you're never going to play RPG games, you just want solid pieces on the tabletop, then the way that these move around is a definite negative for you, because you're not going to get the benefit of being able to go inside the buildings. Because like I mentioned earlier, because of the Rona and all that, I haven't really played many games with these models, but I have put them out on the table. I've had a little mess around with them, so I kind of know that they're not perfect in terms of stability, but I also know that in my opinion they're acceptable. But I want to do some tests now, and we'll sort of see how strong some of this stuff is during gameplay. So like what I've set up here is just quite a cramped environment. This might be good for a skirmish game like Mordheim or whatever, or Lord of the Rings. So I just got some 25mm based figures here. If you're careful, you can get these guys inside up onto platforms. That sort of board I've got across there is a standard bit of board that you get with the set. It's meant to be used for like bridging buildings like this. They move around there, no problem. As long as you're careful when you're reaching around, this stuff's not going to get knocked about. But if you're not careful, it is going to get knocked about. These are just plastic models. There's absolutely no problem using this terrain for plastic models. Perfectly strong for this. No problem at all. That's what you don't want to be doing. Not looking at what you're doing and knocking it over. So yeah, you can kind of see just where then I accidentally knocked it over, that some of this stuff is reasonably easy to knock over, but I wasn't being really careful. So is that the fault of the terrain system, or was that my fault? It's really mainly my fault, to be honest. I've got some larger base models just to sort of show how they fit on. 50mm bases, they fit on okay. Let's have a quick look at the bridge. So I added these little steps onto the bridge to make this curve more usable. So that actually works really well. 50mm bases will fit on there just about. I wanted to use some slightly heavier models here just to sort of give you an idea of the strength of some of this stuff. So I did weigh this guy, this old metal rat ogre. He weighs 57 grams with the base, so that's a couple of ounces if you're in America or you just use old money. There's just absolutely no problem with that. So a reasonably heavy old metal model. The way these are put together, these walkways for example, you can put a lot of weight on these, they're fine. This is one single piece of the card stock, and I think this is going to be a good test as to how strong this card is. We'll just try the heavy metal the heavier metal model on it really. Tell you what, we'll set this up as a proper test. So I'm going to test this single piece of card stock here just to see how strong it is. Straight away you can see there's a cutout here, so it's not even a fully, it's not even a full piece here. So we'll put that there. We'll give it the least chance possible by making sure there's not much of the terrain on these two support pieces here. So you get as many normal models on there as you need. There's no problem with that at all. That heavier rat ogre, no problem on there either really. Well, not really. There is no problem with that. That's fine. I can tell that will just sit there all day and it won't break. Just gonna do another test here. I've got a little pot of paint which is quite heavy. I'd say that's nearly twice as heavy as the rat ogre. You saw the building move there. That's just the building. The actual the sort of card walkway there, that's holding that no problem. I'd say that's about as heavy as you're going to get on a 50mm model base. I don't think you're going to get something much heavier than that, and that's totally fine. But I do want to do a real proper stress test. So I've got this weight that I've weighed. So it's just a lump of metal basically. It weighs 770 grams. So what's that? 15 times heavier than the rat ogre with a fairly small footprint. So let's test it there on that bridge first. that will sit there all day, that's no problem. Let's try it on this, which has got a lot of more stability on the legs. Yep, that's no problem either, that's going to stay there all day. So let's see how it's going to work on here. I can tell that that's not going to... Oh, it holds it, but that will break eventually, I'm pretty sure. That's actually quite impressive how much that holds. So that was 770 grams. It's very slightly bent that out of shape. There's not going to be any models that weigh anywhere near 770 grams. So, you know, for you guys in America, that's 1.7 pounds. So a couple of pounds would probably have bent that, you know, bent that right down and broke it. But you're never going to put something that heavy on this terrain. So I really think weight of models moving on this stuff is not going to be a problem in terms of the, you know, the usability of this terrain. So in terms of giving this stuff a score out of 10 for usability, sort of like during gameplay, I'm going to give it a sort of like a 7 out of 10. I'm going to give it like a 7 out of 10, which I think is a really good score for cardstock terrain. I think I can't imagine there being a cardstock terrain that I would give more than about a 7 out of 10 because of how easy it is to knock over being lightweight, and also just the limitations of the weakness of the material, or the limitations on the strength of the material, I should say, because we did just put a 770 gram weight on that piece there and it didn't break. So 7 out of 10. The main drawback, I would say, is how easily the pieces are knocked when you're playing rather than the weight bearing potential, which is kind of a surprise. You know, when you think about stuff being made out of cardboard, you think it's not going to hold the models very well, but that really isn't a problem with this stuff. I was quite surprised about that. 770 grams. That's impressive that basically just boxboard cardboard holds that. You know, any terrain is going to get knocked about, so if you're going to be reasonably careful, 7 out of 10 is probably an accurate score. You know, if you got gorilla hands and you're bashing stuff about all over the place, then 7 out of 10 is going to be a bit hopeful. You're going to be looking more like 5, 6 out of 10. But if you're that kind of a person, then no terrain is going to be absolutely perfect for you. Hopefully that was a sort of like a, you know, useful indication of using this stuff in gameplay. I think what we're going to do now is just jump on the computer, have a quick look at some other manufacturers' terrain sets, just to get an idea of like what value for money you get from this fantasy village terrain. Then I'll give you my final thoughts. So thanks for sticking with us this far.
So my entire Fantasy Village set, with all the add-ons that I've got, costs around about £150 at retail. A bit less than that if you got it from a third-party supplier. So let's just see what we can get from other manufacturers, other terrain systems, for around about £150. So if we have a look at Games Workshop, I'm going to have to split this across their Age of Sigmar and their Hobbit terrain systems, just to find some stuff that is reasonably equivalent to what we get with the Fantasy Village from Battlesystems, because the Age of Sigmar terrain, you know, is quite out there. It's not really the same style. So what I've picked is what was the old Gardens of Moor set. They call it the Mausoleum now, the Sigmarite Mausoleum. I picked their walls and fences because, you know, you do need some sort of scatter terrain, and also their Lake Town set, which is through their Hobbit, you know, their Lord of the Rings line. I really like the Lake Town set, I've got to be honest, and I think that's partly why I really like the Lake House set in the Battlesystems terrain, because it really does have a Lake Town feel to it. But you can see here, for £150, you're really not getting anywhere near as much. I'd say it's probably not even half what you get through the Battlesystems terrain. But, you know, it would be plastic, it would be a little bit more 3D, so if you had the time and the money, it would probably end up looking a little bit better. But I don't know if it would look as cohesive, because you're having to pick bits of terrain from different lines, basically. So let's have a comparison here with something completely different. We're going to go for some real high-end resin terrain from Tabletop World. Now, this stuff, in my opinion, looks absolutely fantastic. It's got exactly the kind of look that I really like, and I think it's got a look that the Battlesystems terrain is, you know, somewhat emulating as well as it can for cardstock terrain. But, you know, this Tabletop World stuff looks brilliant. However, if you look at the price, you're talking about just getting this one merchant shop for the same price as everything I've got in my Battlesystems collection. So, you know, you just cannot populate a table. To fill a 2x2 table, you're going to be looking at, you know, probably £400-500. And to fill a full gaming table, you're going to be looking at well over £1,000. It would look amazing, but it's just a different level of investment. So it's not comparable. I just wanted to chuck it in just to show what is available from Resin terrain. Something that's a lot more comparable in terms of value for money is laser cut MDF terrain. So got some stuff here from TTcombat. I just put a bunch of things in the basket here to come up to around about £150, so the same amount of money. I'm not saying that all these things that I've selected, you know, perfectly cohesive on the tabletop. Just want to get a rough idea of what we can get for the same amount of money, and I think we get a very similar amount of terrain in total. And it does come unpainted, and, you know, so needs a lot of additional work over and above the building. So just have a quick look at the Elven Woodbine Glen here. You get like a citadel kind of thing. This bridge with some intricate pagoda thing over the top. I don't know what this is here, but it looks pretty cool. Another really intricate building here. Some really nice stuff. I really like this ship and the little dockside platform. Yeah, the Elven City Gateway here, some multi-level structure. I think that looks good. You maybe want to get a couple of those, put them together and have sort of a lot of raised walkways. You know, £24 though, that's the same price as one of the Battlesystems bigger buildings. Fancy Hat's Townhouse here, you know, £21. Same kind of price as the, you know, the medium and larger Battlesystems buildings. And, you know, these are around about the same level of modularity as the Battlesystems sets. So I'd say that these are pretty comparable in terms of the amount that you get, the modularity of the terrain, and also comparable in terms of total price. So I'm just throwing that in there really just to show that, you know, you can get some MDF type terrain for around about the same kind of price. So now we've seen some other terrain systems to, you know, compare them to the Battlesystems terrain. I need to give the Battlesystems terrain a score out of 10 for value for money. So considering everything that we talked about in terms of the quality and the usability, and now comparing it to what else is available out there, which to be fair, I haven't reviewed and I haven't used all of the other terrain stuff that's out there. So taking everything into consideration, I'm going to give the Battlesystems terrain a 6 out of 10 for value for money. Just because overall, my feeling is that you should be able to get cardstock terrain for a bit less than wooden terrain, because a similar amount of precision needs to go into creating the MDF terrain as the cardstock, I would imagine. You know, I know how the cardstock terrain is built and cut. The MDF terrain will need to be laser cut. You know, a lot of work would have gone into designing all of that. So I don't think you can say that the cardstock terrain from Battlesystems would have needed way more research and development and artwork time than the MDF stuff. I just feel like the weight and the extra bulk of the MDF terrain should somehow be worth a little bit more. My score out of 10 for value for money is based on the amount of money that I can spend on a terrain system. If you've got loads of money, then this Battlesystems terrain stuff is going to be more like a 7 or 8 out of 10 for value for money, because, you know, £150 to fill a table is actually pretty good. I'm only marking it down a bit because I've seen that you can get the MDF terrain for a similar amount of money. So if you really like the look of the Battlesystems stuff in comparison to that MDF terrain that I showed you, then really bump up that value for money score. It's very subjective is what I'm saying. So, you know, there we go. That's my entire review. I feel like it's been quite in-depth. It's going to be a long video, so if you stuck through the whole thing, then, you know, fair play. Brilliant. I hope it was useful. Drop me some comments. You know, give us a thumbs up if you did like it. If you didn't like it, you know, give me a thumbs down if you want, but I'd rather you didn't. And yeah, I'd be really interested to know if you've got this Battlesystems terrain and you've been playing with it properly on the tabletop for a long period of time, especially, you know, 6 months to a year. Do leave us a comment just to say how well it's standing up to the test of time. You know, how well it's standing up to the test of time, because I think, you know, in 6 months' time, as other people maybe have a quick look at my review, you know, they might want to know, well, you know, how is this stuff on the table when it's played with every week? And if you've experienced that and you can chuck a comment, that'll really help out other people.